Here's an idea. We live in the future. Just not the hoverboard one. Where are the flying cars? Where is my jetpack? And why on earth do I still need to eat and sleep? How have we not solved these problems yet? Demands and questions made of science by people wondering when the future will arrive. A common lament, this is not the future I was promised. It's tough to say anything was promised. Most signifiers for the future, even a dystopic one, come from a generally Western complex of media that can sometimes make it seem like we're standing on the great precipice of destiny. But really, progress is slow and mundane and woefully irregular. I mean, we all know the William Gibson quote. We are living in some future. I mean, I guess insofar as we're not stuck in some perpetual present, but that is a much lengthier conversation. The question is whether we are living in the future. And I think the answer to this is yes, even given the regrettable absence of hoverboards. And no, this does not count. I'm talking about this. For one thing, if having a pocket computer that can play games, contact your friends and family, access practically infinite knowledge, and sound the club horn whenever you want isn't future enough for you, I don't even know how to deal. But I think there's more to living in the future than just available technology. In my mind, one lives in the future when there is significantly distributed and operable opportunity and a wide understanding that allows one to plan for and effectively construct an even further future, which is a thing we're bad at. It's why it took us so long to stop wandering around just hoping to find food. It's why credit cards exist and are so successful / awful. Planning ahead is hard, but lots of us think lots about it and try valiantly to do it. Socially, environmentally, economically, culturally, scientifically, and we always have. Which is potentially why this framework is super boring. If living in the future means being able to effectively construct one, that means we've maybe been living in the future for a while. Which I think we have. As we've slowly figured out how and why to construct and work towards eventualities as a species, a set of cultures, and a global community, we've gotten better at it. We've maybe always lived in the future. The question is, when do we become good at it? Not quite sure we're there yet. The future's arrival then isn't signified by some piece of technology or scientific capability, but by a set of attitudes and practices of which that scientific capability might be one result. And I guess when you put it that way, it might sound kind of obvious. Another and maybe less obvious question is what happens to that perpetual present that we may or may not be stuck in when we get better and better at constructing our own futures? I don't mean this in that vaguely spiritual sense of you gotta just like live in the present, man, but more like what happens, if anything, to now when it is increasingly fodder for later. There are, of course, degrees and domains to this question. In science and economics, can one ever be too concerned about the future of things? Is one ever not building on past knowledge and hoping their knowledge will eventually be built upon? The practice of all of these things, and history and art and politics, is all about work done now so it may be extended or responded to later. But where constant recording, documentation, reporting, analysis, and responding were at one point clinical practices reserved not exclusively, though mostly, for institutional spaces, distributed technology and an understanding of what it can be used to do has made those things part of the everyday process of living for so many people, their personal and social lives, relationships, and pastimes. And okay, stipulated, for a while now, you could have been the type of person to obsessively document and catalog their life, but today, that's less of a type of person and more of just a thing people do. And I think it goes without saying, but in case you're new here, I will say it anyways, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Of course, there are bad uses of any technology, but at this point, I hope we are bored to death of non-nuanced griping about personal experiences of the world that involve devices. But for all of the red-faced frustration that it causes, the griping does imply something interesting, that for those who gripe, something is happening to now. Not the global now of our present cultural historical moment, though something is definitely happening to that, but the personal individual nows of the people who are self-tracking, tweeting, and taking Instagrams instead of living in the moment or whatever. That gripe, it seems, is that the precious now is deconstructed or disrespected, that our experience of it is somehow ruined in the presence of sharing, documentation, or editorialization empowered by the network. We talked a little bit about this in our mobile phones versus reality episode. When you're at a concert taking a photo, are you really experiencing it? And that is something that only the person taking the photo can answer. Either way, correct or not, this moment does change based upon the chosen method of experience. It must, otherwise this conversation wouldn't happen. Maybe it's that the practice of documenting and sharing creates a separate, concurrent now. Not a better or worse one, just another one. Maybe it's that there is the physical now, happening at the concert or the dinner party, and then there is the now in images, represented by photos and text. And some people, believing those two nows to be mutually exclusive, see the first as being cheapened for what is ostensibly the ability to return to it later, at some future point, in turning now into later. And so maybe that's what all of this is, the collecting and collating of our present experiences so that we may return to them in the future. And through that, the construction of some potentially upsetting dichotomy of the present. But I don't know, I mean, I rarely return to my Instagrams, tweets, vines, videos. Is it instead that I'm doing it for the attention? Maybe. But I mean, my impulse to post this photo from the Country Music Hall of Fame wasn't, whoa, look where I am. It was more like, here's this thing for you, if you want it. Maybe what happens to now in the face of distributed documentation and editorialization is that instead of creating a dichotomy or several distinct nows, the resolution of the one big now is increased. We get to see all, or I guess much more, of what now is, a multiverse of all of the actually possible nows. And that in the eyes of the gripers, that now is less so, because it is so often coupled with here, a private kind of local experience spoiled by hyperconnection. If true, this could be one explanation for FOMO, or the fear of missing out. With now at such a high resolution, the pressure to navigate to the correct or most fulfilling sector is potentially really high. From this perspective, now isn't a time and a place, but a choice and an imperative, which maybe it always was, but today, right now also has an audience. What do you guys think? How do you determine whether or not we live in the future? And has the idea of now changed in response to available technology? Let us know in the comments, and of course, please subscribe. Let's see what you guys had to say about living in the future. Hey, Chris Fox on the subreddit talks about the expansion of the now due in part to things like Snapchat, and they're focusing on certain events in certain cities around the world for one day, and talks about how, actually I wanna quote this, I wanna make sure I get this right. Essentially teleporting our brains to a completely different continent and experiencing a brief moment of someone else's life that would otherwise have been private and undocumented. And I can't help but make the connection to Sense8, which is the Wachowskis' new show that just got released on Netflix, and it's about this group of people who have this kind of mental connection with one another. And I recently learned on Twitter that it is supposed to kind of evoke this tension of technology, that it is simultaneously bringing us together, but then also arguably pushing us apart. And yeah, this was a great comment. Thanks for writing this. Evie writes a really great comment about how for lots of people around the world, the future is not necessarily a time so much as it is a place, and that place is the Western world. And that's something that in the episode I spent a sentence on, but really we could probably spend much longer on it. And yeah, it's this idea that for a lot of people, the popular construction of the future is an economics, technology, and energy-based extrapolation based in, like Western ideals, Western culture, Western values. And that, if you look at a lot of literature from around the world, you can see constructions of the future that don't rely on those things and provide really interesting alternatives to what a future could look look like if it's not based in those things. So yeah, this is a great perspective, really important thing to consider. This comment, also really great. Thank you for writing it. Narwhal Hats talks about how now might be changing because of an obsession with authenticity. And I think that this is interesting, that if someone is taking a picture, they're not having an authentic experience, and it's rooted in authenticity less than reality. And yeah, I think that there's something to think about there. Mark, I have been to those clubs, and let me tell you, things don't go well. Friend of the show, Mr. Dr. Shane Tilton, has provided a link to an open access article that he wrote about the impact mobile technologies have had on people to document their everyday lives, so definitely check this one out. Carrie Callahan writes a really great comment that sort of asks whether or not we should be recasting what we think of the future as being, and that if it's generally defined technologically, this makes me think about what happens if we define a future socially. What if we take the technology stuff as granted or as even stable, but think about what an ideal future is, culturally, societally, politically, and I think that there is a lot of room for that kind of thought. Dale, I think that this is interesting and fair. I think a lot actually about the ethics of being a tourist and taking photos, whether or not it's like okay to take photos in certain situations, whether or not it's all right to advertise that you are in a certain place and having such a great time. And we were recently at the Grand Canyon with the PBS DS crew, and I was saying that it's in some way a little unethical to not take photos of the Grand Canyon with people in them, because there are people everywhere. There is no experience of the Grand Canyon that is as wide open and personless as all of the photos that you see. So I actually spent a good portion of the time we were walking around taking photos of other people taking photos, because it felt more honest. To Halcyon and everyone else that pointed out that it is classism and not classicism, thank you. There are several words that I will always get wrong. I think that's one of them. I will pretty much probably always say rhetoric instead of rhetoric, and I always get the plural, is it of simulacrum? Simulacra. See, I still don't. This is like a part of my area of study that I enjoy, and I still don't know which one is the plural one. It's a part of my brain that just doesn't work. Madeline Kohler writes a really great comment talking about the Kardashev scale and Moore's law, and this makes me wonder about this idea that as we continue to future as a verb, how and why and in what manners will it get increasingly more difficult to continue to future? That's quite the question, isn't it?